The Indian Removal Act of 1830 stands as a stark reminder of the complexities and contradictions within American history. This act, signed into law by President Andrew Jackson, authorized the forced removal of Native American tribes from their ancestral lands in the southeastern United States. The stated goal was to open up these lands for white settlement and expansion. This act, however, represented a significant betrayal of treaties and a blatant disregard for the sovereignty of Native American nations. The Removal Act was driven by a combination of factors, including the desire for fertile land in the Southeast, and the belief in the inherent superiority of white settlers. This belief, deeply ingrained in the fabric of American society at the time, fueled westward expansion and justified the displacement of indigenous populations. The Act's passage marked a turning point in the relationship between the United States government and Native American tribes, setting the stage for decades of forced assimilation and cultural destruction. The Removal Act was met with immediate resistance from many Native American tribes, who viewed it as an existential threat to their way of life. These tribes, including the Cherokee, Creek, Chickasaw, Choctaw, and Seminole, had established deep roots in the Southeast, developing their own governments, economies, and cultural practices. They argued that the United States government had no right to seize their lands, especially after signing numerous treaties recognizing their sovereignty. Despite their protests, the implementation of the Removal Act proceeded with brutal efficiency. Federal agents, often accompanied by armed militias, coerced tribal leaders into signing removal treaties, often under duress or through deception. These treaties, often negotiated with individuals who did not represent the will of the majority, ceded millions of acres of Native American land to the United States government in exchange for promises of compensation and reservations in the West. President Andrew Jackson, a hero of the War of 1812 and a staunch advocate for westward expansion, played a pivotal role in the passage and enforcement of the Indian Removal Act. Jackson, a product of his time, viewed Native Americans as obstacles to progress, believing that their removal was essential for the nation's growth and prosperity. Jackson's views on Native Americans were shaped by his own experiences fighting against them in various military campaigns. He saw them as savages who stood in the way of civilization and argued that their removal was not only justified, but also beneficial for both parties involved. He believed that by relocating Native Americans to lands west of the Mississippi River, the United States government would be protecting them from encroachment by white settlers and allowing them to preserve their traditional way of life. The Democratic Party, which Jackson helped to found, largely shared his views on Indian removal. The party's platform advocated for the expansion of white settlement and the opening up of new lands for agriculture and industry. Jackson's popularity among white voters, particularly in the South and West, emboldened him to pursue his Indian removal policy with vigor. Despite facing opposition from some members of Congress and religious groups, Jackson used his political capital to ensure the passage of the Indian Removal Act. He argued that the act was necessary to prevent further conflict between white settlers and Native Americans, and he dismissed the concerns of those who opposed it as misguided or unpatriotic. The Indian Removal Act was met with widespread condemnation from various segments of American society. Religious groups, particularly Quakers and some Protestant denominations, denounced the act as immoral and inhumane. They argued that it violated the principles of Christianity and called for the government to respect the rights of Native Americans. Some members of Congress, notably Senator Theodore Frelinghuysen of New Jersey and Congressman Davy Crockett of Tennessee, spoke out against the Removal Act, arguing that it was a betrayal of the government's treaty obligations and a stain on the nation's honor. They pointed out the hypocrisy of a nation founded on principles of liberty and justice, denying those same rights to its indigenous population. Despite these voices of dissent, the Jackson administration moved forward with the implementation of the Removal Act. Between 1830 and 1850, tens of thousands of Native Americans were forcibly removed from their homes and marched westward to lands west of the Mississippi River. This forced migration, known as the Trail of Tears, resulted in the deaths of thousands of Native Americans from disease, starvation, and exposure. The Cherokee Nation, in particular, suffered immensely during the Trail of Tears. Despite having adapted to Western ways and developing a written language and constitution, the Cherokee were forcibly removed from their lands in Georgia and other southeastern states. The journey westward was marked by suffering and death, with an estimated 4,000 Cherokee dying along the way. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 casts a long shadow on American history, serving as a stark reminder of the country's legacy of dispossession and injustice towards its indigenous population. This act, driven by a toxic mix of greed, prejudice, and a belief in manifest destiny, had devastating consequences for Native American tribes, shattering their communities, cultures, and economies. The forced removal of Native Americans from their ancestral lands not only resulted in immense suffering and loss of life, but also had long-term implications for their social, cultural, and economic development. Confined to reservations, often on lands ill-suited for their traditional ways of life, Native Americans faced poverty, disease, and the erosion of their cultural identities. The trauma of removal continues to reverberate through generations, impacting their health, well-being, and sense of place. In recent decades, there has been a growing movement to acknowledge and reconcile with this dark chapter in American history. Scholars, activists, and Native American communities have worked tirelessly to raise awareness about the injustices of the Removal Act and its lasting legacy. This has led to a greater understanding of the complexities of Native American history and a push for more equitable policies and relationships. The Indian Removal Act stands as a cautionary tale, reminding us of the dangers of unchecked power, prejudice, and the human cost of expansionism. It serves as a reminder of the importance of respecting treaties, honoring the sovereignty of indigenous nations, and recognizing the inherent rights of all people.